Thanks for checking out this fellowship message video. We pray it encourages you and draws you closer to Jesus. Also, don't forget to follow us online at @formacalm or at fellowshipchapel.net. It's the best way to stay connected to the life of the church.
You may be seated. I have been waiting for this series. And you might be wondering why. Well, the reason is it's quite simple. I have a business background, and I love finance, and I love Jesus. And the series is a combination of finance and Jesus. It's that simple. And so I got really excited. And so I'm excited, and all of you are probably like, oh, a series about finances and Jesus. Where's the door? Well, let me just caution you, you don't need to run out on us yet, but let me challenge you to stick with us as we go through a 4-week series called The Generous Life. And it's during this time of year that maybe you're starting to think about something called Christmas. Halloween's over. Some of you have already turned on the Hallmark channel and are already watching the Hallmark movies. And as you've been going through that, you're thinking about Christmas, and maybe you have kids at home or grandkids, and this wonderful company that's in our world now called Amazon decided this year to send out this magazine that your kids are looking at, and they're saying, oh, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and you're thinking, I love you so much, but how do I graciously tell you no? And so even this morning, my little 3-year-old was, Dad, I got to look at my book this morning. And I'm thinking, why has that not ended in the trash can yet? And it's the Amazon book. Let me look through what toys I want to tell you that I want. And that brings up the thought, how am I going to pay for such toys? How am I going to afford that? And oftentimes we go through the Christmas season, and Christmas is a time where generally we feel very generous. Oh, I want to give this to Aunt Susie, and I want to give this to Cousin Bobby, and we feel very generous about it, and we want to help those, and it's this time of year that you start to see people showing more generosity, maybe paying for more things in the drive-thru, paying for those behind them. You see people will be out ringing their bells, and we'll have the red kettles by every store. You begin to see generosity increase during this time of year. And then January hits, and the credit card bill comes. And you look at your bank account, and you wonder, wow, I felt generous, but now it hurts a little bit. And so the whole premise of this series, the whole reason behind this series, is to enter the holiday season understanding and viewing money and our finances and our generosity the way God views them, and preparing ourselves ahead of the curve. I know some of you early planners have already done Christmas shopping. Just bear with us. We couldn't do it in June, so I'm sorry. But as we go through it, just see how God might be speaking to you. And I'm going to have this challenge that I'm going to lay out for us, and I want this to be the challenge that you think about throughout your series. What is the highest bill that you pay every single month? Is it your food bill? Is it your mortgage payment? Is it your rent payment? Is it your health care bill? Which that just seems to be going up and up and up. I had another kid, and they didn't tell me that increased my health care as much as it did. What is your highest bill? And if you don't know what your highest bill is, your starting point is figuring out what your highest bill is. Let's just start there. And what is your highest bill? What is the highest thing that you pay? And here's what I want you to think about. What would it look like to give away more than your highest monthly bill? What would it look like? What if you gave away more than your highest monthly bill? And many of you are thinking, yeah, that's crazy. That's asinine. That's insane. What is he thinking? But think about it from this perspective. What if this question helped us think about what house we buy, what apartment we rent, what healthcare plan we pick? What if this question changed our perspective of how we view what we purchase. I think there's two ways that often people approach financial situations. The one is that we can develop healthy and godly financial practices. I think the way that God lays it out for us is very helpful in us being able to be prepared to handle finances. And so one approach is that we can look at how we spend and how we budget and how we do things and try to implement a routine there. The other one is we can pray for a giant raise at work or to win the lottery. We have two choices. We can either look at what we've been given or we have, and we can say, God, how can I most use this so that I'm not struggling anymore? I'm not going through pain anymore. Or we can just pray for that scratch off to finally pay off for us. I got some for a surprise birthday party yesterday, and I won $3. So I'm telling you that the odds are not really stacked in your favor from my personal experience of that winning you money. And even if it does, even if you get that big promotion, even if you win the lottery, chances are if you have not developed good, solid practices how to handle with what you've been given now, those same habits, as we're going to talk about next week, are going to continue into what you have later. In fact, of all the lottery winners, catch this, 70% of lottery winners are bankrupt within 5 years. 70% of lottery winners are bankrupt within 5 years. Oftentimes we think if I just get the windfall, all of a sudden my life is going to be so much easier. If we look at statistics and we look at what other lotto winners would tell us, what we will quickly realize is it's actually the exact opposite. The minute you start making more money or people know you have more money, guess what happens? Hey, Aunt Susie, can you really buy me that toy? And you're probably a little bit more, you know what? Yeah, sure, here's a check. Hey, Aunt Susie, can you do this for me? Yep, here you go. And all of a sudden, the reason that most lottery winners would go bankrupt is because their generosity habits change so drastically that they give so much money away that then they end up realizing they have no money left for themselves. Or all of a sudden they get into houses that they really shouldn't have gotten to, or buy cars that they shouldn't have gotten in. And this is why, over and over again, I've met people in very high professions, attorneys and doctors, people who have really good professions that should be maybe having higher income than others, and they will tell you that they're broke. They'll say, I can't make it. I can't pay those bills. And it's maybe because they took on so much debt as a student, as part of it. It could be that they're trying to live in a house that they've always dreamed of and just aren't ready yet. The reality is that as we develop these habits, we'll realize as we look in our text today that our spending habits and our generosity isn't seasonal. It's not something that we do at a certain time. It's not something where we feel, oh, I'm going to be generous because it's coming up to Christmas. Oh, I'm going to be generous because all of a sudden I have more money than I had before. Generosity isn't seasonal. It's not a, I will do this when. Because when will it ever be enough? When is that when? And so the key throughout this series is how do we develop healthy habits now so that as God continues to add to what we've been given, those habits continue on. In fact, if you study most millionaires, actually are some of the most frugal people you will ever meet. And so when you see someone pulling out that coupon book at the grocery store, don't assume that they don't have much. Because chances are, those are the people who actually have the most. You can even study millionaires who will tell you that they pack their lunches just to save some money than buying lunch every single day out to eat. It's one of those things where as they were developing habits, they were able to see, they were able to handle their money better. Our passage throughout this series is going to be a letter that Paul wrote to a church in Corinth. And so we're going to be in 2 Corinthians. It's a second letter that he wrote to them. He wrote 1 Corinthians to them. Then he writes 2 Corinthians to them. And we're going to be in today chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. And we're going to be digging through this and seeing how we can see that generosity isn't seasonal. And we can see what we're called to do through that. And so if you want to use a chair Bible around you, it's going to be page 828. But what's interesting as we go through this letter is we're going to not be looking at ourselves compared to the church in Corinth, which is in a part of Greece, but we're going to be comparing ourselves to the church in Macedonia, which would be in northern Greece. And we're going to see what their practices and their habits led to. So just follow along with the first 5 verses with me. We want you to know, brothers. So this is saying, look, hey, brothers in Corinth, we want you to know something about the grace that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. We want to tell you a story. We want to tell you a story about what is happening in these churches in Macedonia. For a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. In this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. I love the New Living Translation, how it lays out the first part of this, verse 2 for us. It says it this way, about the Macedonian church, they are being tested by many troubles, and they are, catch this, can you say it with me? Understand their setting. They're poor. They're not just poor, they're very poor. The Macedonian church is showing something despite their poverty. And have you ever noticed that it easily seems to be generous when we have an abundance, but hard when we have less, or we feel like we're poor? Here we see a church in Macedonia, Macedonian Christians who are not just poor, they're very poor. And as we're going to see, they're generous. And the question becomes, how? Well, the first thing we will see is that rich generosity flows out of joyfulness. Look at what verse 2 goes on to say. They had a severe test of affliction, but catch this, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have what? Have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. There's a couple of things in here that make for an interesting formula. There's joy, there's poverty, and there's generosity. If we look at this, we see that they have an abundance of joy. They have extreme poverty. And they have a wealth of generosity. Now this seems interesting to me because I feel in my personal thought, this is just me just being frank, I don't think joy alone pays the bills. Like I can't just say, hey, I'm really happy today, and so my bills are all of a sudden going to get paid. Yes. That seems kind of like an odd component. And I don't really think that poverty often pays the bill. Oftentimes I think of poverty, I don't think, oh, I'm going to be able to pay the bills because I don't have money. That just doesn't logically make sense to me. And then for those to actually lead into rich generosity, that is just mind-blowing. And so we have to dig in a little bit more. We have to understand where their joy is coming from, how they have gotten that joy, and why that joy, in combination with their poverty, has actually led to rich generosity. I've shared this story numerous times, and I share it over and over again because it was a story that changed my whole worldview. The short story of it is I went on my first ever mission trip to Belize, Central America. If you haven't heard of Belize, it's just south of Mexico. The reason we went there is the one country in Central America that speaks English. And so we went there because we knew that we wouldn't have to have a translator. And what we went with was 2 suitcases. One suitcase full of our stuff and one suitcase full of stuff to give away. And I saw generosity in that city in Belize more than I've ever seen in my life. And this is how. We went up to this little hut. I'll never forget this little hut, a whole entire family in this one room place that I thought might just be collapsing at any moment. And I looked as they had a little clothesline with just a few clothes hung up. And I gave this woman a pair of pants and I said, "Ma'am, we have pants for you. We just want you to know that these have come all the way from America just so that you would know the love of Jesus." And she looks at me. She says, "I don't need those. I have a pair on my body now, and I have a pair hanging up. Use that for someone else." Do you know how humbling that is when I went back home to my walk-in closet? I thought I was being nice by giving something away. And this woman saw that generosity was, I have more than enough because I have 2 pairs of pants. And we're not talking a place that's very cool. I mean, Belize is hot. When I was there, I think I went through 3 pairs of pants a day, let alone being able to wear them for a whole entire day and having enough, more than enough. And so our passage in verses 3 to 5 is going to show us that there's a few components to understanding when we're generous. What makes us generous? What describes us as generous? Is generous because we write a big check? I would argue it's not about how much you write. There's a story in the Bible where Jesus talks about a woman who gives 2 coins compared to those who give a wealth of money. And he points to her and he says that she is more generous than they are. So I don't know if it's about having a big checkbook or writing a big check. I don't know if that makes us generous. Generosity is more of what I saw in Belize that day. A woman who says, "I have more than enough, let me share." And so there's 3 things that come up to help us understand, am I really being generous? Or what does it look like to be generous? The first is that it stretches us. Catch this. "For they gave according to their means, as I can testify." This is Paul describing the Macedonian church to the Corinthians. And he's saying, look, church in Corinth, the Macedonians, they gave according to their means, as I can testify. Now this is really challenging to me, because I feel that so often this is my barometer for generosity. Well, I'm giving in my means. I have it nicely in my budget spreadsheet. I'm giving what I am comfortable giving. It's not hurting too much. It's within my means. And the Macedonians were doing it. They were giving, let's say, their 10%. They were giving, hey, we have $2, and we're giving our portion of that. But this is what is so interesting. This doesn't end with a period. So often we stop generosity with a period here. We say, yep, we give within our means, period. But there's a comma. And then there's a word, and. And what does it say? And beyond their means. That's where it gets challenging. It stretches them. The Macedonian church wasn't just doing what they felt comfortable with. They were doing something beyond what was comfortable. And this is really, really hard. In my community group, I meet with men. There's like 6 or 7 men. They're a community group on Monday nights. And we've been going through a book that has really been challenging me. In fact, it's the book's called All In. It's by Mark Batterson. And as we've been going through it, I've been listening to it on audiobook now for the 2nd time. And so I'm always in the gym on Monday morning listening to this. And it always has something that comes up that stops my workout. I'm like, why am I listening to this in the gym? Like, it is just completely hitting home. And there was a story about a man. Now, this man is in his hundreds. He's still alive today. And his name is Stanley Tam. And if you ever drive down I-75, you'll pass a town called Lima, Ohio. Now, I'm from Ohio, so I think personally the story's going a good direction just because it starts in Ohio. Others of you are a little more skeptical, I understand. But in Lima, Ohio, there's a company called United States Plastic Corporation. And Stanley Tam founded this organization. And it was early as he was getting this company off the ground that he felt a prompting from God to catch this, to give his company over to the Lord. What does that mean? How do you give a company over to the Lord? Well, he met with lawyers and accountants, and he literally gave 51% of the company to God. 51%. He said, you know what? This is not my company, this is God's company. Now, I know a lot of Christian business owners. I don't know many Christian business owners who literally say 51% of the company is God's. Stanley did. He said, you know what? 51%. 1955 comes, and he's convicted by God. Stanley, you've only gone partially in. You haven't gone all in. Now, I think 51% of your company's doing pretty good, don't you? I'd be like, yeah, Stanley, you got it, man. You're going to go to heaven. You're going to be like up on those chariots, and I'm just going to be cleaning the toilets. Like, good job, Stanley. You're doing awesome. But no. And that's not an accurate picture of heaven, just so you know. I was just... All right. So Stanley, he gives, not, you know what, 51% is not enough. I need to give 100% of my company to God. And in 1955, he handed over 100% of United States Plastic Corporation to God. Since then, over $140 million have been given away to kingdom work. Talk about stretching you. That is stretching you. But it doesn't just stretch you. It's done willingly. Look at 2 Corinthians verse 3, the second part of it, where it says this: For they gave according to means in their part, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord. Another translation puts it a little more clearly for us, and they gave out of their own free will. I think so often we feel like giving is a have to. I have to give. I got to give God my portion. I got to give my part away. You know, I have to give so that I can lower my tax bracket, and then I can actually save money in the end. I have to do it. But what's interesting about the Macedonian church is they point to something that is common with all of us. God is not a God who wanted us to be a bunch of robots. He's a God who gave us a free will. He allowed us to make decisions, and this is why we see a lot of the things that we see in this world. He said, look, I don't want you to be my little minions. I want you to be my servants. I want you to serve me, but I've given you this gift. It's your own free will. You can make decisions. And here we see the Macedonian church. They're not giving because they have to. Paul's not sitting there twisting their arm. Come on, Macedonian church, let me just get a little bit more money. Because we see they're giving the money back to Jerusalem later on. Give a little bit of money back to the church in Jerusalem. Come on, come on. No, they had a willingness to it. In fact, giving is not a have to. It should be a get to. And so if our heart behind giving is I have to give, oh, Robert preached that sermon. Now I have to write my check to the church. Do you know why we took the offering before we actually gave the message? Because there's no have to. It's a get to. God doesn't want you to have to give to Him. He wants your heart to give to Him. It's something that you get to do out of your own free will. I love when I get to do things. I love getting to spend time with my wife. I love getting to spend time with my family. I do not like having to do things. Yesterday is a prime example. I said I wouldn't use it as an illustration, but here it goes. Yesterday, I am literally reluctant. Why do we have to go to this bowling thing? Come on, Jessica. I'm done with it. Our schedule's packed. I don't want to go. And we've been in a small group since we started here. It goes back to when we started. We've been in a small group. She's like, you know, our old small group, we're getting together. We're going to go bowling. And I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. Going to go bowling, whatever. Lo and behold, it was a surprise birthday party for me. I had to go. it felt like a strain. And it's a horrible illustration because at the end of the day I enjoyed it, but here's the point. I don't like having to do anything. I'm sure many of you don't like having to do anything. You put your heels in a little deeper when that's the case. And so giving shouldn't be something that you feel dragged to have to do, but rather it should be something that you do willingly. It should be something that you find enjoyment in. And I can tell you that we've personally in our family been really wrestling with this very point, because we have in moments helped people in our life that we felt God calling to help, and you know what? It doesn't come with much reward back. In fact, sometimes it comes with a few slaps in the face. And we've had to do a gut check and say, you know what? Are we giving because we want something back? Or are we giving something because we feel God leading us to and we just want to, not because we have to? And that's been a gut check that I've had to wrestle with, and I know we always will when we come to things like that. The passage goes on, and the third thing is not only that it stretches us, not only is it done willingly, but generosity, it's a privilege. Look at what verse 4 says for us. The first word, begging. The Macedonians aren't like saying, hey Paul, sure, we'll do it because you want us to. They're begging. Begging for what? They're begging us earnestly for the, can you say this word with me? Favor. They're begging earnestly. They're saying, Paul, no, we want to do it. Because why? This generosity, despite our being poor, despite our struggles, despite us not having much right now, we want the favor of what? Taking part in relief of the saints. We want to do it. It's something that we in ourselves want to do. There is great joy that comes through generosity. I struggled with this for a long time when people would take me somewhere and they'd say, hey, I want to pay the bill. And I would fight them over and over. No. Why? Because my pride was getting in the way. I didn't want them to pay the bill. And then all of a sudden, a mentor of mine said something that changed my life. He said, why would you take away the joy of someone else's generosity? So often in our own thinking in my life, I was trying to have my pride say, I don't need help from someone. I don't need them to be generous. But really, there's a joy that people have when they're generous. We see this goes all the way back to even the Israelites. There's God's people, they're called the Israelites, and these are who we'd follow as the Jews. They continue to follow. And so if we go all the way back to the Old Testament of the Bible's in two parts, Old Testament and New Testament. And if we go back to a book called Chronicles, we're going to look at 1 Chronicles chapter 29, and it's going to be page 306, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of summarize it. There's this king named David. Maybe you've heard of David before. He's king over the people. And he says to the assembly, Solomon and my son, Solomon, who wrote Ecclesiastes, wisest man in the world, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great. For the palace will not be for man, but for the Lord God. And so he's saying, look, we're going to build this temple. My son is going to help build this temple. And he gives of his own. And then all of a sudden, if we keep going down, we see starting in verse 6, and the leaders of the Father's house made their free will offerings, as also did the leaders of the tribes, and the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, and the officers of the king's work. They gave for the service of the house of God. And all this that they gave, there's the amounts. And whoever had precious stones gave them in the treasury of the house. And catch verse 9. This is what hits home. So the people rally, they give, they say, we're going to build this temple for God. Then the people did what? They rejoiced because they had given willingly. They weren't forced to. They didn't have to. They did it out of their own free will. Same thing we're looking back with the Macedonians. For with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. It's this beautiful picture of how they rallied together and they said, you know what? We're going to give. We're going to give because it's a privilege. We're going to give because it's something not that we have to do, but we want to do. We can do it willingly, and we're going to give even when it stretches us. Back to Corinthians. What about this joy? Where did it come from? We find it in verse 5, where it says this, "In this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first." They gave themselves first to the Lord. This hits home. And then, by the will of God, to us. If we truly want to find that joy that leads into generosity, there's one step that we must take. And it's first giving ourselves to God. It's first saying, you know what? I'm yours, Jesus. And when we make that step, something drastically changes in our lives. In fact, joyful generosity starts with Jesus. Everything you have been given has come from somewhere. Guarantee it. I have witnessed my two sons both enter the world for the very first time and breathe their very first breath. And I can tell you it wasn't very pretty. They were naked. They were gooey. They were filled with this thing that they had to wash them off with. They didn't come with much. But God gave them much. And everything they have been given in their first few years of life has been a gift from God. Not because they said, hey, Dad, I can't wait for that sweater. No, it's a gift from God. Everything that you and I have been given, even if our life has seemed a little gooey and messy and yucky, and it doesn't seem like we've been given much, I guarantee there is no one naked in this room right now. And whatever you have been given has been a gift from God. And no matter what your story is, no matter what your struggle has been, no matter what has caused you to get to this very moment, you have been given something. You might not feel like it's enough, but it's more than enough because somehow you arrived here safely. And our generosity and what we have isn't about comparing to what others have. It's comparing to where our heart is in relation to Jesus. And when we can say, you know what, God, I'm yours and nothing is my own, we can then begin to change our framework of how we view generosity. Back to the story of Stanley. I was so marveled by him giving 100% of his company away that I wanted to know what happened. So I went to their website. And right on their website, they share what happened when he gave the company away. And here's some statistics. 404,978 people have made a decision for Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior because one man gave his company to God. 125,229 people have been baptized because one man gave a decision to give his company to God. 31,406 churches have been formed because one man decided to give his company to God. And even though he's in little hillbilly Lima, Ohio, which I think is a very nice town, 52 countries have been represented in all of those statistics. I think Stanley got something that we're to learn from. In the first step, we're going to go through 4 steps, is to start by recognizing that what you possess has a God-given purpose. Whatever you have, God has given you for His purpose. And you might not know what that is yet. But bear with us, because as we go through this, we're going to see that God has a plan for each and every one of us. So maybe your first step today is just to say, you know what? I need to start with Jesus. I need Him to be at the center of my life. Maybe that's your first step to financial freedom. And I would challenge you that when you start to walk with Jesus, you begin to see our lives look a lot more like His. And so if that's you, I would love for you to come to one of our prayer intercessors after service and say, I just want to start with Jesus. And we will follow up with you and make sure that we help you in doing that. That's step one. And let me end with this. Stanley is over 100 years old. He gave in 1955 100% of his company to the Lord. And he still has money. He still is alive. He's over 100 years old and God has looked after him. So often I think we're worried about walking, if we give our lives to the Lord, is he going to turn his back on us? And the truth is, he just wants more of you, not less of you. And so maybe today you would take that step. Will you pray with me? Father, we thank you for being a God who is so generous to us. That despite our shortcomings, God, you came into the world and you gave of yourself. Lord, you came and you gave us you. God, we're so grateful for that. And this morning I pray that we would take a step of saying, you know what, God, what we have, everything we've been given, is a gift from you. That God, it's not something we possess, but God, it's something that you have given to us. And so God, would you help us on this journey as we begin to look at how, God, you have given that to us for a unique purpose. God, would you just reveal that purpose to us? And God, right now, if we're struggling and if we're just wondering how are we ever going to be able to be like that church in Macedonia, God, would we just have a faith that they had, that a joy after you is all that we really need. And so God, I pray that you would fill us with more of that. In your name we pray. Amen.